In the winter of 1979, General Boris Gromov received his orders for Afghanistan the way Soviet generals had received difficult orders for 30 years, without comment, without question, and with the private knowledge that the men giving the orders did not fully understand what they were asking. Gromov was not a political general. He was a soldier's soldier, the kind of officer the Red Army produced in abundance, technically proficient, ideologically compliant on the surface, and underneath both of those layers, deeply practical about what armies could and could not accomplish. He had studied military history. He had read the assessments of Afghanistan that his predecessors had filed and that the Politburo had ignored. He knew what the terrain looked like, what the population thought of foreign armies, and what had happened to every previous power that had attempted to pacify that particular stretch of Central Asian mountain and desert. He went anyway, because Soviet generals went where they were sent. What Gromov could not know in 1979, what no one in the Soviet military establishment was permitted to say out loud, was that Afghanistan was not simply a difficult military operation. It was the moment the entire Soviet system began to reveal its structural cracks to anyone willing to look carefully enough. The Red Army that entered Afghanistan was not the Red Army that had ground down the Wehrmacht across 2,000 miles of Eastern Front. It was a different institution, in a different era, fighting a different kind of war. And the differences mattered in ways that Soviet doctrine had never accounted for. To understand why the Soviet system collapsed, you have to understand what had held it together. And to understand that, you have to go back to the men who built it. The Soviet military system that emerged from World War II was built on a specific theory of human motivation. That theory held that soldiers fought best when the consequences of not fighting were worse than the consequences of the enemy. This was not cynicism. It was the conclusion drawn from the catastrophe of 1941, when Soviet armies collapsed before the German advance, not primarily because of inferior equipment or tactics, but because the institutional structures that were supposed to compel men to stand and fight had failed. Stalin's response to that failure was systematic and brutal. Order 227, issued in July 1942, was known simply as not one step back. It created blocking detachments, NKVD units positioned behind Soviet lines whose explicit function was to shoot any soldier who retreated without orders. It established penal battalions where men convicted of cowardice or desertion were sent on suicide missions to clear minefields with their bodies. It made the calculus of survival simple. The enemy in front of you might kill you. The men behind you definitely would if you ran. This system worked. It worked at Stalingrad and Kursk, and in the assault on Berlin. It produced soldiers who held positions that by any rational military calculation should have been abandoned. It produced commanders who attacked. When attacking meant certain death for most of their force, because the objective mattered more than the men. But the system that worked in 1942 when the Soviet Union was fighting for literal survival began producing different results when applied to a different kind of war in a different era against a different enemy. The Afghan Mujahideen were not the Wehrmacht. They did not fight in formations that could be encircled and destroyed. They did not hold territory that could be captured and held. They disappeared into mountains and villages and returned to fight again from directions that Soviet tactical doctrine had not been designed to address. Every Soviet advance produced the appearance of progress. Roads secured, towns occupied, flags raised, and none of it translated into actual control of the country. Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan discovered something that their doctrine had not prepared them for. They could occupy any piece of ground in Afghanistan. They could hold it with sufficient force. But the moment they moved on, the Mujahideen returned, and the local population, which had no particular love for either side, but considerably more long-term fear of the people who lived next door than of the foreign army that would eventually leave, cooperated with the fighters rather than the occupiers. This was not a new problem. It was the oldest problem in counterinsurgency warfare. But Soviet doctrine, built around the concept of decisive battle between organized military formations, had no effective answer for it. General Gromov watched this unfold with the particular frustration of a competent officer executing an incompetent strategy. The Soviet army in Afghanistan was not incompetent at the tactical level. Soviet Spetsnaz, special forces, were skilled, aggressive, and effective in direct action operations. Soviet artillery was accurate and overwhelming. Soviet air power, particularly the Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship, was technologically sophisticated and genuinely feared by the Mujahideen. In conventional engagements, when Soviet forces could bring their firepower to bear against a concentrated enemy, they won consistently. The problem was that the enemy refused to concentrate. The Mujahideen had studied the Soviet way of war with the focused attention of people whose survival depended on understanding it. They knew that Soviet doctrine called for fixing the enemy with firepower and destroying them with maneuver. They declined to be fixed. They attacked Soviet convoys on roads where air power could not easily distinguish fighters from terrain. They melted into villages where artillery could not follow without killing the civilians the Soviets theoretically needed to win over. They exploited the one vulnerability that Soviet military culture had never adequately addressed: the unwillingness of a conscript army, far from home, fighting for objectives it did not understand, to sustain casualties indefinitely for a cause that its officers could not convincingly explain. Soviet conscripts in Afghanistan were not the volunteers of the Wehrmacht or the ideologically motivated fighters of the early Red Army. They were 18-year-old boys from Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Siberia who had been told they were fulfilling their international duty and arrived to find themselves in a war that made no sense against an enemy that never appeared in the form they had been trained to fight. The drug use that became endemic in the Soviet Afghan army was not primarily a moral failure. It was a symptom of institutional collapse. Soldiers discovering that the system that had sent them here had no coherent answer for what they were experiencing and no real interest in their survival beyond their function as warm bodies in defensive positions. 8,000 miles away, American military planners were watching Afghanistan with the focused attention of professionals who recognized an opportunity. So the CIA program that armed and funded the Mujahideen, eventually codified as Operation Cyclone, represented American strategic thinking at its most cold-blooded. The United States was not going to send soldiers to Afghanistan. Vietnam had settled that question for a generation, but the United States was willing to spend money, supply weapons, and provide intelligence to anyone who was willing to kill Soviet soldiers. The Stinger missile, a man-portable surface-to-air weapon that gave Mujahideen fighters the ability to shoot down the Mi-24 helicopters that had given Soviet forces their most significant tactical advantage, arrived in Afghanistan in 1986. Its effect was immediate and measurable. Soviet helicopter losses increased sharply. Soviet pilots changed their tactics by flying higher and faster in ways that reduced their effectiveness in close support of ground troops. The operational tempo of Soviet offensive operations slowed. This was American military thinking applied without American soldiers. The lesson Vietnam had taught was not that America could not win wars. It was that America could not sustain politically unpopular wars indefinitely. The solution was to find ways to impose costs on adversaries without the domestic political vulnerability of American casualties. The Stinger program was that solution made hardware. It did not require congressional authorization for deployment. It did not produce flag-draped coffins returning to American cities. It did not generate the kind of sustained public opposition that had broken the Vietnam War effort. It simply made Afghanistan more expensive for the Soviet Union, month by month, year by year, until the expense became unsustainable. Soviet generals understood what was happening. Their intelligence assessments accurately identified American involvement in the Mujahideen supply chain. They filed reports documenting the effectiveness of American-supplied weapons. They requested resources to counter American strategic support. The Politburo received these reports, acknowledged them, and continued the war anyway, because stopping would have meant admitting failure, and the Soviet system had not built adequate mechanisms for admitting failure. This was the asymmetry that mattered. The American system, whatever its flaws, had a mechanism for processing defeat. Vietnam had been a catastrophe, and America had absorbed it, argued about it. I reformed its military around the lessons of it, and emerged a decade later with a professional volunteer force that was more capable than the conscript army it replaced. The Soviet system had no equivalent mechanism. Defeat was not processed. It was denied, reclassified, and buried under layers of ideological necessity until it became structural rot. The men who understood this best were not politicians or intelligence analysts. They were the Soviet officers who had served in Afghanistan and returned to write assessments that their superiors did not want to read. Colonel Oleg Sarin, who served in the Soviet General Staff during the Afghan War, wrote privately that Afghanistan was revealing something the Eastern Front had concealed, that the Soviet military system was designed for one specific kind of war and could not adapt to another kind. Without institutional changes, the system was constitutionally incapable of making. The Eastern Front had rewarded mass, firepower, and the willingness to accept casualties. Afghanistan required something different: patience, cultural understanding, light infantry tactics, the ability to operate in small units with decentralized authority. Every one of those requirements ran directly against the principles that Soviet military culture had been built around. Decentralized authority was particularly problematic. A Soviet tactical doctrine concentrated decision-making at higher levels specifically because decentralized authority was considered a bourgeois indulgence, the kind of individualism that capitalist armies practiced because they did not understand collective discipline. Soviet junior officers were trained to execute orders, not to exercise judgment. In the complex, fluid environment of Afghan counterinsurgency, where situations changed faster than orders could travel up and down a rigid chain of command, this produced paralysis at exactly the moments when initiative was most needed. American military doctrine, rebuilt after Vietnam around the concept of mission command, giving junior officers the objective and the resources and trusting them to find the best method, was not something Soviet officers could easily replicate. It required a different kind of trust between ranks, a different relationship between officer and soldier, a different theory of what military professionalism meant. Gromov recognized this. He could not say it in any official report. He could not recommend institutional changes that would have implied the existing institution was wrong. He could execute his orders as professionally as the system allowed, which he did, and he could prepare his withdrawal as cleanly as possible, which he also did. When Gromov crossed the Friendship Bridge out of Afghanistan on February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier to leave, walking alone across the bridge in a moment of theater that he had arranged deliberately, he turned and stated for the cameras that no Soviet soldier remained behind him on Afghan soil. It was technically true. It was also the most honest public acknowledgement the Soviet system had produced of what the war had cost. Behind him, in the decade of fighting, 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and an entire generation of officers had been educated in the gap between Soviet military doctrine and military reality. The gap between doctrine and reality was not limited to Afghanistan. It ran through the entire Soviet system by the 1980s, and the men who could see it most clearly were the ones who had served in both the theoretical world of Soviet military education and the practical world of actual operations. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff from 1977 to 1984, was perhaps the most intellectually formidable Soviet military thinker of his generation. He had studied American military development with genuine respect and genuine alarm. He understood that the revolution in military affairs, the integration of precision weapons, advanced sensors, real-time communications, and computer-assisted command was fundamentally changing what modern war looked like. He understood that the Soviet military, still organized around the mass army concepts of World War II, was falling behind. Ogarkov wrote and spoke about these concerns with unusual candor for a Soviet officer. He argued that the Soviet Union needed to reorganize its military around smaller, more capable, more technologically sophisticated units. He argued that the information dimension of warfare was becoming as important as the firepower dimension. So he argued that Soviet industrial priorities needed to shift to support a different kind of military. He was removed from his position in 1984. The system that had built its authority on the memory of the Eastern Front could not accommodate the argument that the Eastern Front model was obsolete. The generals who had fought that war, or whose careers were built on its mythology, controlled the institutions that would have needed to change. And those institutions had spent 40 years developing immunity to exactly the kind of external pressure that might have forced adaptation. This was the fundamental difference between the American and Soviet military systems by the 1980s. Both had failed in recent conflicts. The Americans had failed catastrophically in Vietnam. The Soviets were failing incrementally in Afghanistan. But the American system had produced mechanisms for incorporating failure as information. Congressional investigations, journalistic scrutiny, internal military reform movements, a professional military education system that encouraged critical analysis of past operations. The Soviet system had produced mechanisms for concealing failure as threat. Political officers monitoring dissent, career destruction for officers who raised uncomfortable truths, an official history of the war that bore diminishing relationship to what had actually happened. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and began his program of glasnost and perestroika, he was attempting to do something that Soviet generals had privately known was necessary for years: force the system to process reality rather than deny it. What Gorbachev did not understand, and what became clear with brutal speed, was that a system built on denial cannot simply choose to stop denying without the entire structure coming apart. The military consequences were direct and immediate. Soviet officers who had spent careers navigating an institution that punished honesty now faced an institution that claimed to reward it, but had not changed any of the underlying incentive structures. The result was not reform. It was confusion. Officers who did not know which set of rules they were operating under, institutions that received contradictory signals about what was expected, a military culture in transition between two incompatible sets of values with no clear guidance on how to navigate the space between them. General Gromov, back from Afghanistan, watched this with the same practical clarity he had brought to everything. The Soviet military was not being reformed. It was being destabilized. Glasnost was not producing honest assessment of Soviet military capability. It was producing public acknowledgement of Soviet military failure without the institutional infrastructure to translate that acknowledgement into effective change. The American military, by contrast, had already been through its equivalent crisis. Vietnam, the hollow army of the 1970s, the failed Iran hostage rescue, the shock of recognizing how far American conventional capabilities had degraded, and had emerged from it with Goldwater Nichols, airland battle doctrine, a professional NCO corps, and a volunteer force that was by the mid-1980s arguably the most capable conventional military in the world. The Soviets were beginning the crisis the Americans had already survived, but they were beginning it without the institutional mechanisms that had allowed the Americans to survive it. The end came faster than anyone predicted, not because the Soviet military was defeated in battle. It never was, not directly, not by American forces. It came because the system that sustained the military, that provided its ideology and its resources and its political authority, simply stopped being able to maintain the fiction that it was working. Soviet soldiers who had served in Afghanistan came home to a country where the official version of the war bore no relationship to what they had experienced. They came home to economic stagnation that made the material superiority of the American system impossible to deny. They came home to a political system that was visibly, publicly, losing the argument about which way of organizing a society produced better outcomes for the people living under it. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, not because an army breached it, but because the East German government, faced with hundreds of thousands of its citizens demanding the right to leave, could not find the will to shoot them all. The calculation that had sustained Soviet occupation doctrine for 40 years, that the threat of force was sufficient to compel compliance, failed at the moment it was most needed, because the men who would have had to pull the triggers no longer believed the system they were defending was worth the cost. That failure of belief was the Soviet system's terminal condition. It had been building for years in the gap between official doctrine and operational reality, between what Soviet officers wrote in their reports and what they said to each other in private, between the mythology of the Eastern Front and the reality of Afghanistan. General Gromov understood it. Marshal Ogarkov had seen it coming. Dozens of Soviet officers at every level had filed assessments in the 1970s and 1980s that, read together, told the story of an institution that had stopped being able to learn from its own experience. The Americans had arrived at the Elbe in April 1945 as the junior partners in an alliance, fresher, less tested, less scarred than the men they met across that river. Soviet generals had assessed them as capable but limited, competent but untested, unwilling to pay the prices that real war required. What those Soviet generals could not see was that the American system's apparent softness, its casualty aversion, its political constraints, its impatient public opinion, its insistence on explaining to soldiers why they were fighting, was not weakness. It was a feedback mechanism. It was the system correcting itself in real time, incorporating failure as information, discarding what did not work, and replacing it with what did. The Soviet system had no equivalent mechanism. It had substituted ideology for feedback, political loyalty for honest assessment, and the mythology of the Eastern Front for genuine strategic thinking about what the next war would require. 46 years after the meeting at the Elbe, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, not because it was defeated militarily, not because American forces overcame it on any battlefield, but because the internal contradictions that Soviet generals had privately identified and publicly denied for decades finally became impossible to sustain. Boris Gromov, the last Soviet soldier out of Afghanistan, lived to see it. He became a politician in the new Russia, one of the officers who navigated the transition from one system to another with the same practical competence he had brought to everything. He never publicly said that he had known Afghanistan was unwinnable from the beginning. The habit of not saying what you knew was too deeply ingrained. But in interviews late in his career, he said something that captured the essential truth of what the Soviet military had learned too late and too expensively. An army reflects the society that builds it. Means when the society stops believing in itself, the army stops being able to fight. Not because the soldiers lack courage, but because courage alone was never enough. He could have said it about Afghanistan. He could have said it about the entire arc of Soviet military history, from the Elba to the collapse. He probably meant both. The soldiers who had met at the river in 1945 were mostly dead by the time the system one of them served finally fell apart. They had shaken hands across dark water and shared cigarettes and not known what the next 50 years would look like. The American went home. The Soviet stayed. And what the staying eventually cost, in lives, in treasure, is in the slow, grinding destruction of an institution that could not tell itself the truth about what it was becoming, was the final answer to the question those Soviet generals had been asking since the first day they saw American soldiers on the western bank of the Elbe. Not whether Americans could fight. They could. Not whether Americans would sacrifice. They would. But whether a system that valued individual soldiers, absorbed institutional failure, and corrected itself through the messy, inefficient, often humiliating mechanisms of democratic accountability could outlast a system that valued collective sacrifice, denied institutional failure, and maintained itself through the clean, efficient, ultimately fatal mechanisms of ideological control. The answer took 46 years to deliver. It was not delivered on a battlefield, as it was delivered in the gap between what Soviet generals knew and what they were permitted to say. A gap that widened for decades until the weight of everything on the wrong side of it became too heavy to carry. If this series changed how you think about the Cold War, share it with someone who thinks military history is only about battles. The battles matter. But the systems behind the battles matter more. Subscribe for the full series. Leave a comment. Which moment in these 3 parts surprised you most? Our community spans continents, and we are grateful you're here. Thank you for watching.